The night the bells rang, there was no wind. No storm. Not even the faintest breath of air to move the rusted ropes that had hung motionless for decades. Yet, sometime after midnight, the villagers of Altenbruck were awakened by the hollow, metallic echo of the old church bells. 3 slow tolls. Then silence. Then 3 more. Those who still lived near the church, mostly the elderly who couldn't afford to move, swore they heard the sound vibrate through their walls, shaking old family portraits and rattling window glass. Others refused to speak about it at all. Because the bells of St. Gertrude's Church had not rung since 1962. By morning, the fog lay thick over the village square, swallowing the crooked roofs and the headstones behind the chapel. A group of laborers, sent by the local council to begin long-delayed restoration work, stood in front of the heavy oak doors. They were chained shut, as they had been for 60 years. Their supervisor, a man named Keller, looked uneasy. He wasn't from the village, he'd come from Bremen, a city man used to logic and deadlines. The whispers of curses and haunted stones meant nothing to him. But as he lifted his crowbar to break the seal, an old woman standing by the fence called out, "Let it stay closed. The dead don't like being disturbed." Keller gave a polite smile, pretending not to hear. The chain snapped. The door groaned open. A thick breath of air escaped from inside, damp, stale, and earthy, like something had been buried alive. The interior was a frozen memory. Candles half melted into puddles of wax. Pews coated in dust and pigeon droppings. Cobwebs draped like funeral veils over the altar. And then, on the far wall, beneath a cracked fresco of St. Michael, something caught Keller's eye. A fissure. Thin, jagged, running from floor to ceiling. He stepped closer. The plaster around it was darker than the rest, as though moisture, or something else, had seeped through. He touched the edge, and part of it crumbled under his fingers, revealing a pale shape beneath. At first, he thought it was limestone. But as he brushed away the dust, he froze. It was not stone. It was bone. Word spread quickly. By noon, half the village had gathered outside the churchyard, their faces tight and unreadable. Some crossed themselves. Others whispered prayers. But no one seemed surprised. An old man muttered, "It was bound to come out one day." A younger villager, clearly unnerved, asked him what he meant. The old man didn't answer. He only stared at the church's crumbling tower and said softly, "The bells were warning us." Later that day, local police cordoned off the area, but even they seemed hesitant to go inside. The walls were thick, built before the wars, and it would take time to safely extract whatever was inside. That evening, a local reporter managed to speak with one of the officers as they packed up their tools. The man refused to go on record but muttered something the journalist would never forget: "It's not just one body." As night fell again over Altenbruck, the church stood silent, its shadow stretching long across the square. Only the faint creak of the bell tower could be heard in the wind. At around midnight, residents swore they heard the bells again, 3 slow tolls. Then silence. But this time, the sound didn't come from above. It came from within the walls. Narration-style cue, for voiceover. For decades, the people of Altenbruck pretended nothing happened inside St. Gertrude's Church. They stopped holding weddings there. Stopped burying their dead in its yard. Stopped praying altogether. Because deep down, every soul in that village knew the same truth: something, or someone, was buried in the walls. Altenbruck wasn't always silent. Long before the walls began to whisper, it was a place of laughter, a cluster of red-roofed cottages nestled between 2 rolling hills, with a river that shimmered like glass in the morning sun. Farmers would bring milk to the square before dawn, children would chase one another between the wells, and at exactly 6 o'clock every evening, the bells of St. Gertrude's would call the faithful to prayer. For generations, faith was the village's heartbeat. Every birth, marriage, and burial passed through the same church doors. The altar cloth was embroidered by grandmothers who died decades ago, and the candles burned with the faint smell of beeswax and pine. And then, one winter night in 1962, it all stopped. The story, as it's told by those old enough to remember, begins with snow. A blizzard rolled in from the north, covering the village in white silence. By morning, the church doors were locked, and Father Matthias Kruger, the parish priest, was gone. At first, no one panicked. Priests sometimes traveled, to neighboring towns, to conferences, to retreats. But when Sunday came and no mass was held, people grew uneasy. The next Sunday passed, and the bells remained still. The village council wrote to the diocese. No answer. Letters went unanswered, calls ignored. It was as if Father Matthias had simply been erased. Then, rumors began to replace facts. Some said he'd fled after a scandal, that he'd fathered a child with a young woman from the choir. Others whispered that he'd stolen the church's gold chalice and disappeared. The more superstitious swore he'd been taken, that he'd angered something ancient in the crypt below the altar. The older generation, however, said nothing. They simply stopped speaking of him, as though silence could smother guilt. Over time, the walls of St. Gertrude's began to rot. Moss crept up the stone steps, vines twisted through the stained glass windows. No one volunteered to clean it. No one dared to reopen it. When a group of teenagers broke in one night in the 1970s, they returned home pale and shaking. One of them refused to speak for months. The others moved away before winter. The church became a monument to fear, and to forgetting. Inside the village café, where the same 6 men still play cards each morning, the subject of the church is forbidden. If a stranger asks, conversation stops, chairs scrape, and someone changes the topic. In 1991, a reporter from Hamburg tried to write about the mystery of the missing priest. He lasted 2 days before leaving, claiming he'd never met people so afraid of their own history. The silence is generational, passed down like a curse. Children grow up knowing not to ask why the old church stands locked, why no one rings the bells, why there are no weddings, no funerals, no confessions. The people of Altenbruck still baptize their babies, but they drive to the next town to do it. They still hold Christmas dinners, but never sing hymns. And on Sundays, when the sun touches the tower's broken cross, they close their curtains. Among the few who still remember the winter of '62 is Frau Margaret Edel, now 86. Her hands tremble when she speaks, and her eyes avoid the window that faces the churchyard. She was 23 when Father Matthias disappeared. She tells the camera, softly, he was a kind man. He listened. He helped my husband when the mill burned. But the week before he vanished, he changed. He stopped eating. He said confession every day, to himself. When asked what happened that final night, she pauses for a long time. The clock ticks in the background. Finally, she says only, there was shouting. Then the bells. Then, nothing. Her eyes fill with tears, and she whispers something that the microphone barely catches, they told us to forget. So we did. After the disappearance, the diocese sent a letter, short, formal, cold. It declared Father Matthias transferred due to health reasons, and appointed no replacement. The bishop who signed it died 2 months later. No further correspondence arrived. And so, the church stood empty. For 6 decades, the people of Altenbruck lived in its shadow, attending to their fields, their markets, their quiet lives, but never speaking of faith. They called themselves believers, yet they never prayed aloud. The absence of sound became their only religion. When the wind blew from the north, villagers claimed they could hear faint hymns from within the sealed church, the same hymns they used to sing as children. No one dared to go near enough to check. Today, the building leans slightly to one side, its steeple cracked from frost. Grass grows through the cobblestones. Children who play too close are pulled away by their parents. And yet, every year on December 14th, the night the priest vanished, someone leaves a candle at the church door. Always a single white candle, always burning before dawn. No one knows who places it there. No one wants to. Narration Q, voiceover. The people of Altenbruck learned to live without their church. They learned to silence the bells, the hymns, even their memories. But silence has a way of keeping secrets alive. And when the walls finally broke, the village discovered that faith, once buried, never truly dies. Before he became the ghost of Altenbruck, Father Matthias Kruger was a man of warmth, and of contradictions. In the only surviving photograph of him, taken in 1957, he stands outside St. Gertrude's Church, snow falling lightly around his shoulders. His face is young but solemn, eyes soft yet alert, the kind that see more than they admit. Children crowd around him, laughing. One of them holds his hand. He is smiling in the picture, but his eyes are not. It was said that Matthias could make even the most skeptical farmer kneel in prayer. His sermons were quiet, personal. He spoke of compassion, not punishment. His words reached people in a way no priest before him had managed. He became a fixture, baptizing babies, blessing harvests, sitting at deathbeds. For a while, Altenbruck believed it had found its saint. But saints rarely stay saints for long. Born in 1918, Matthias Kruger grew up in the ruins of post-war Germany. His father, a railway worker, was killed in an Allied bombing. His mother died of pneumonia a year later. He was raised by his uncle, a priest, in the small town of Lüneburg, where he discovered both solitude and faith. Those who knew him at seminary described him as brilliant but distant. He was fascinated by theology, especially the writings of St. Augustine, the struggle between divine love and human desire. He wrote once, in a letter to a classmate, "We are told to kill desire, yet it is desire that proves we are alive." When he was assigned to Altenbruck in 1951, the village was still recovering from the scars of war. Men had returned missing limbs, families had lost sons, faith had become more habit than hope. Father Matthias arrived with energy, rebuilding the choir, repainting the altar, restoring the old organ. He visited every home personally, blessing each doorway, speaking softly about forgiveness. He seemed tireless. Until 1961. That's when things began to shift. In his surviving diary, discovered decades later in a decaying parish drawer, the tone changes abruptly around that year. Early entries are filled with gratitude, notes about harvest blessings, baptisms, festivals. But later pages grow darker, fragmented. January 4, 1961, I wake with the sound of bells that are not ringing. February 17, there is a woman who comes to confession but never speaks. She only weeps. I know her name, though she never says it. March 2, the walls hear me. The stones keep secrets. If I stop praying, I feel them listening. Scholars who studied the diary years later believe this was not insanity but guilt, a man trapped between faith and forbidden love. Her name was Anna Weiss. She sang in the choir, 22 years old, the daughter of the local tailor. Parishioners recalled her as quiet, devout, and radiant in a simple way. She often stayed after Mass, helping to clean candles or fold linens. Whispers soon followed. She was seen walking with Father Matthias through the orchard behind the rectory. Sometimes they met at dusk, when no one else was around. At first, villagers believed the priest was offering guidance, spiritual comfort. But one evening, a farmer returning from the field saw them standing close together beneath the old fig tree. Their hands touched. Their heads bowed. The next Sunday, Anna stopped singing in the choir. The church divided overnight. Some defended him, saying Father Matthias was a good man, incapable of sin. Others turned on him with quiet contempt. He became a man surrounded by silence. Children stopped visiting the rectory. Mothers crossed themselves when he passed. The bishop's office sent an inspector, who stayed 2 days and left abruptly. Whatever was discussed between them was never recorded. But that week, the priest's sermons changed. Gone were the warm messages of forgiveness. Instead, he spoke of fire, of temptation, of judgment. Even the purest soul, he said one Sunday, carries a shadow that kneels beside it. The congregation sat in uneasy stillness. In late autumn, he began locking himself in the church after dark. Villagers walking home reported candlelight flickering through the stained glass windows at midnight. Some heard murmured prayers. Others claimed to hear sobbing. Then, one night, a young altar boy entered the church to retrieve his forgotten coat. He saw Father Matthias kneeling before the altar, face buried in his hands. Behind him, a woman's shoes lay on the floor. The boy ran home and told no one. December arrived heavy with snow. The village prepared for Christmas, though the church remained strangely cold. Father Matthias cancelled the nativity play, saying it was not appropriate this year. In his diary, the final entry is dated December 13, 1962, the day before he vanished. "Forgive me, Lord. I have sinned in silence. And silence has answered me." The rest of the page is stained, as though it had been touched by wet hands. Those who saw him that night remember strange details. He rang the bell at dusk, alone, though there was no service scheduled. He walked through the square, whispering blessings to no one. Some say he carried a small box wrapped in cloth. At midnight, the bells rang again, 6 times. And then, silence. He was 9 years old when the church began to haunt him. His name was Johann Bauer, though the villagers called him Hans the Quiet. He rarely spoke, not because he was shy, but because he claimed that when he did, the walls answered back. In 1962, he was the youngest altar boy at St. Gertrude's, small, pale, with dark hair that always fell over his eyes. His father worked the mills, his mother sang in the choir. Hans spent more time in the church than anywhere else, sweeping aisles, polishing the candelabras, arranging hymn books. He was devoted to Father Matthias. To him, the priest was more than a holy man, he was a protector, a figure of calm in a world that often frightened him. Until the winter the drawings began. When the restoration team broke through the wall 60 years later, they found something besides the remains. Folded among the debris, inside a rusted tin box, were a series of crumbling paper sheets, children's sketches drawn in pencil and charcoal. The images were disturbing in their innocence. A church. A man in robes. And walls, bleeding. Thick, black strokes pouring down from the ceiling like rain. In one, a figure was trapped behind bricks, hands pressed outward, mouth open in a silent scream. Above it, a child had written in careful block letters, "He said not to tell." The sketches were signed, J. Bauer, 1962. When investigators tracked him down in 2020, Johann was 67 years old, living alone in a care home 2 towns away. He'd never married, never had children. His room was sparse, with a crucifix on one wall and an old rosary on the other, the beads worn smooth from years of use. At first, he refused to speak about the drawings. He said he didn't remember them. Then, slowly, as if the act of remembering hurt, he began to tell his story. "I used to hear things," he said softly, his voice trembling. "Not voices. Not exactly. More like, breathing. From behind the altar." He said that on the night before Father Matthias disappeared, he had been in the sacristy, cleaning chalices. The priest was pacing, muttering to himself. Hans remembered asking, "Father, are you sick?" Matthias smiled, but it wasn't the warm smile Hans knew. It was strained, fearful. "Go home, Hans," the priest told him. "Lock your door. Don't come back tomorrow." But the boy didn't go home. Curiosity, or maybe devotion, made him stay. He hid in the confessional, watching through the narrow lattice as Father Matthias knelt before the altar, whispering prayers. Then came another sound, the church door creaking open. A woman's voice. Hans didn't see her face clearly, but he remembered her red shawl. She was crying. The two spoke in whispers, their words blending with the sound of wind. Then, a sharp noise, like something falling, followed by silence. Moments later, the candles went out. When Hans woke, it was dawn. The church was empty. At first, he thought he'd dreamed it all. But when he turned toward the wall near the altar, he saw something that froze him in place, a thin red line, running down the plaster. He thought it was paint, until he touched it, and it smeared warm across his fingers. Blood. Terrified, the boy fled home. He told his mother what he'd seen. She slapped him, told him never to speak of it again, and made him swear on the cross to keep silent. That night, men gathered in the churchyard. He saw them through the window, familiar faces from the village, carrying lanterns. He never knew what they did inside. But the next morning, the church was sealed, and Father Matthias was gone. Weeks later, Hans began to draw. He couldn't sleep. He said the church came to him in dreams, the sound of bricks being laid, the faint toll of bells that no one else heard. He drew what he couldn't say. He drew the bleeding walls, the trapped man, the candles melting down to bone. And then, one afternoon, his teacher asked him what the pictures meant. Hans didn't answer. He only said, "They told me to paint over the crack." The next day, his family left Altenbruck without warning. They moved north and never returned. Decades later, when journalists showed him copies of his childhood sketches, his eyes filled with tears. "I remember now," he whispered. "It wasn't paint. It wasn't rain. I think I heard him calling." He said he still dreams of the church sometimes, but in those dreams, the walls are breathing. When asked if he believed Father Matthias was murdered, Hans fell silent for a long time. Then, almost inaudibly, he said, he wasn't the only one. His words sent shivers through the investigation team. The forensics report had already confirmed what Hans's drawings implied: the remains found in the wall belonged to two people. A priest. And a woman. It began at dawn, under a sky the color of wet ash. The team from the Historical Preservation Society arrived with quiet precision: surveyors, archaeologists, two forensic specialists from Berlin, and a local priest who insisted on blessing the ground before a single stone was moved. No one in Altenbruck had ever seen so many strangers gathered around their church before. The villagers watched from a distance, whispering, clutching their coats against the cold. The excavation had been ordered after the accidental discovery of the bones. Officially, it was a structural investigation meant to assess the stability of the church. Unofficially, everyone knew what they were there for: to find out who, or what, had been buried in its walls. As the morning mist lifted, the crew began to work. Scaffolds were erected, lights fixed, and soft brushes replaced shovels when the first cracks in the stone appeared. The sound of scraping tools echoed through the nave, mingling with the faint hum of prayers from Father Benedict, the overseeing priest. Dr. Anja Keller, the lead archaeologist, moved methodically. She was calm, sharp-eyed, and clinical, the kind of woman who had seen too many graves unearthed to be easily shaken. Yet even she felt uneasy about this one. Something about the silence of the church seemed unnatural, like the air itself was holding its breath. By midday, they had opened a section near the altar where the wall had first given way. The bricks came loose one by one, revealing a hollow cavity that extended deeper than expected. Dust filled the air, and the smell, a strange mix of mildew, incense, and something faintly metallic, clung to every breath. Inside the cavity, the team found remnants of fabric first, dark threads fused into the mortar. Then, as Dr. Keller brushed away the powdery debris, the outline of a human skull emerged. The socket stared out blankly, framed by fragments of wood and rotted cloth. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the second discovery was made. A smaller skeleton, lying partially beneath the first. The position was unnatural, as though it had been forced in hastily, pressed against the wall before the bricks were sealed. A murmur spread among the team. 2 bodies. Keller called for the forensic unit to take over. Every inch of the cavity was documented, photographs, laser scans, notes scribbled in the margins of clipboards. Father Benedict crossed himself repeatedly, muttering verses under his breath. When the remains were finally removed, the team noticed something else wedged deep within the crevice, a rosary, its beads cracked and blackened with age, and beside it, a rusted ring. The ring's band bore an engraving so faint it was barely legible, in fide, silentium. In faith, silence. The phrase sent a chill through Keller. She had studied enough medieval Latin to recognize the motto once used by secret Catholic orders, the kind that punished betrayal with death. That evening, as the light dimmed and the church stood hollow, the remains were laid out on clean white sheets under the cold glow of floodlights. The forensics team worked quietly. One by one, the bones were measured, catalogued, and sealed in sterile containers. The older skeleton, presumed to be male, had suffered blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with a single heavy blow. The smaller skeleton, likely female, showed signs of binding at the wrists and neck. Keller frowned as she studied the fractures. This wasn't a burial, she said softly. It was concealment. The villagers who lingered outside didn't need a translation. They had already begun whispering names. Father Matthias. And the red-shawled woman. When word spread through Altenbruck that a woman's body had been found beside the priest, the silence that had held the town for decades began to crack. Old people who had never spoken of that winter suddenly locked their doors. Others packed small bags, muttering that some things were better left buried. A few, however, remembered fragments. A woman named Marta. She had come from a neighboring town, unmarried, mid-20s, and known for her temper. She worked in the rectory kitchen for a short time before she vanished. Some claimed she had been sent away. Others whispered she had been pregnant. But when Dr. Keller brought this up during a local interview, the response was always the same, a nervous glance, a shake of the head, and the quiet phrase, "We don't speak of her." The deeper the team dug into the church records, the stranger the inconsistencies became. Parish logs from 1962 showed a sudden interruption, pages missing, entries smudged. The name of Father Matthias appeared for the last time on December 11, written in a different hand, followed by a blank page. Keller, reviewing the documentation, felt as though the church itself was resisting the investigation. Files misplaced. Tools breaking. Lights flickering without cause. That night, one of the assistants reported hearing a rhythmic tapping sound from inside the walls, like someone knocking faintly from within. The crew laughed it off as settling stone, but the priest insisted on reblessing the site the next morning. Meanwhile, in the forensics lab miles away, the bones began to reveal their story. The male skeleton's jaw was broken, likely post-mortem. The female's left hand was fractured, and traces of lime were found on both sets of remains, suggesting they had been hastily entombed to mask odor and decay. But the real shock came when radiocarbon dating confirmed the time of death, late 1962. Exactly when Father Matthias vanished. Keller stared at the report, her fingers trembling slightly. 2 bodies. Same year. Same place. The implications were devastating. Had the priest killed the woman? Had the villagers killed them both? Or had someone else, someone with the power to silence an entire town, orchestrated the cover-up? She looked up at the church that evening, its stained-glass windows glowing faintly in the dusk. Whatever happened here, she whispered, they built their faith on top of it. The next morning, while examining the debris removed from the wall cavity, an intern found something small, a fragment of parchment, rolled tightly and wedged between bricks. It was brittle, almost disintegrating, but under magnification, faint words could still be seen, "He forgives us, but not the sin. No one could determine who had written it. But the handwriting, according to local historians, bore resemblance to the church's old clerical records. It was likely written by Father Matthias himself. By the week's end, the church stood half open, its insides exposed, an autopsy of stone and faith. The villagers grew restless. Rumors spread like wildfire, that the excavation had disturbed a curse, that spirits were angry, that the bells had begun to ring at night though no one pulled their ropes. Dr. Keller dismissed it as superstition, until one night she stayed behind to photograph the site alone. The air was cold, heavy. Her flashlight flickered. Somewhere near the altar, she heard the faint sound of dripping. When she looked up, a line of moisture ran down the wall, clear, not blood, yet following the exact path of the old stain described by the boy, Johann Bauer. And in that moment, Keller realized something chilling: the stain was forming from the inside out. The wall was weeping. She stepped back, camera shaking in her hands. For the first time since she'd arrived in Altenbruck, she felt afraid. The bodies told their story long before anyone dared to listen. In a sterile laboratory on the outskirts of Munich, under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, the remains from Altenbruck lay on two separate tables, the priest and the woman, side by side again after 60 years of silence. Each bone, each fragment, each trace of dust was a letter in a language of the dead, waiting to be read. Dr. Anja Keller stood at the edge of the room, watching as her forensic partners, Dr. Lucas Brandt and Professor Amelia Voigt, began their analysis. Both were veterans of grim work, war graves, mass burials, forgotten crimes. But even they moved carefully, almost reverently, as if afraid the bones might whisper if disturbed too roughly. "Start with the cranial trauma," Brandt said quietly. "It'll tell us who struck first." The male skull, belonging to Father Matthias, bore a deep indentation above the temple. The wound was blunt, heavy, the mark of a single, decisive blow. No defensive fractures were found on his forearms, meaning he never saw it coming. "Instant death," Brandt murmured. "He didn't struggle." Then came the second set, smaller bones, lighter frame. The woman. Her injuries told a different story. Wrists bound. Jaw dislocated. A fracture at the base of her neck, consistent with strangulation. There were faint cuts on her ribs, old, healed scars, and something strange lodged between the ribs on the right side, a fragment of cloth, dark red even after decades underground. A red shawl. The same one the child, Johann Bauer, had described in his memory. For hours, the team worked in silence, their movements deliberate, methodical. Every discovery added another piece to a picture that was beginning to look less like a murder and more like an execution. But the question that haunted them wasn't how they died. It was why. When the DNA results came in 2 weeks later, the first shock hit like a hammer. The female's genetic material matched traces found on the male's personal effects, specifically, on the inner lining of his rosary pouch. They had been close. Intimately close. Keller stared at the report in disbelief. A priest bound by vows of chastity, and a woman whose existence had been erased from every parish record. The silence of the village suddenly made sense. That night, Keller returned to her hotel and opened the old photographs recovered from the church archives. Most were routine: baptisms, harvest blessings, Christmas choirs. But in one faded picture from 1961, she noticed something she hadn't before: Father Matthias standing beside a group of parish women, his expression solemn. Next to him, half in shadow, was a young woman with a scarf tied over her hair. Her shawl was unmistakably red. The caption beneath read simply, "St. Gertrude's Feast, 1961. Keller enlarged the photo on her laptop. The woman's face was gentle but haunted, eyes cast downward, lips tight as if suppressing a secret. In that frozen image, Keller could almost feel the tension, a forbidden story hiding beneath the surface of holiness. Back in the lab, Professor Voigt had discovered something else. Inside the priest's ribcage cavity was a small piece of parchment, wrapped around a rosary bead. Under ultraviolet light, faint ink became visible, words scrawled hastily, almost desperate. I absolve her, and myself. It was signed with a cross, not a name. The implications were devastating. If genuine, it meant Father Matthias may have been complicit, not only in his own downfall but perhaps in the concealment of hers. Had he killed her in a moment of panic? Had he tried to protect her? Or had they both been victims of something far larger, the kind of collective sin that an entire village could bury and call holy? Keller called the diocesan archives in Freiburg. The archivist's tone changed the moment she mentioned the name Matthias Albrecht. After a pause, the man said softly, "That file was sealed in 1963 under the bishop's order. You're not authorized to access it." When Keller asked why, he replied, "Because it was not a crime. It was a penance." And then he hung up. Back in Altenbruck, word of the lab results spread like wildfire. The villagers began to close their shutters early. Some swore they saw lights flicker inside the church at night, even though power had been cut for months. One elderly woman, Frau Stein, approached Keller outside the bakery. Her hands trembled as she handed over an envelope yellowed with age. "He confessed to me once," she whispered. "Before they took him." Inside the envelope was a page torn from an old journal, written in Father Matthias's hand. "She came to me seeking mercy, not love. But I was weak, and in that weakness, I doomed us both. They said it was God's will, but I heard only man's fear. They will seal the wall tonight. I go willingly, for she should not suffer alone." Keller reread the words again and again, her throat tight. This wasn't murder. It was sacrifice. If Father Matthias and the woman, Marta, most likely, had been found together, sealed within the church wall, it meant he hadn't been killed elsewhere and hidden. He had chosen to die there. But who had laid the bricks? Who had built the wall that became their tomb? The villagers' silence now felt less like complicity and more like shame, the kind of collective guilt that festers for generations, spoken only through superstition and fear. In the following days, Keller's team used ground-penetrating radar to scan beneath the church floor. They discovered several hollow spaces, cavities that shouldn't have existed according to the blueprints. Within one, they found remnants of lime, cloth, and wooden boards. These were signs of ritual construction, sealing chambers not as graves, but as atonement structures. Professor Voigt explained it grimly: in some remote regions, during scandals involving clergy, the church itself was used as the confessional. The sinner was entombed alive, their death considered the ultimate penance, ensuring divine forgiveness. The horror of it hung in the air. If this was true, then Father Matthias's death was not an act of rage or secrecy, but of faith twisted into punishment. And the woman's presence? Perhaps she refused to live without him. Or perhaps she was forced to share his fate. Either way, their silence had become the foundation of the church itself. Late that night, Keller sat alone in her car outside St. Gertrude's. Rain drummed softly on the windshield. The steeple loomed dark against the sky. She listened to the sound of the rain, steady, rhythmic, and thought of the phrase engraved on the ring they'd found, in fide silentium. Faith through silence. Now she understood. The village had kept its faith by keeping it secret. And in doing so, they'd turned their church into a monument of guilt. She closed her eyes and whispered, almost as a prayer, "He forgives us, but not the sin." The diary was small, leather-bound, and unassuming, yet it carried more weight than any of the bones, blood, or evidence the team had uncovered. It had been discovered tucked behind a loose panel in the rectory, preserved beneath decades of dust and neglect. The cover bore no title, no name, only the faint imprint of a cross pressed into the leather. Dr. Keller handled it carefully, as if the pages might bleed or whisper. From the first page, the voice of Father Matthias was unmistakable. It was a man caught between faith and fear, devotion and desire, morality and despair. January 3, 1962, the church is quiet tonight, yet I feel the walls listening. Even the stones seem to know my thoughts. I pray for guidance, but my heart is heavy. The handwriting wavered in places, the ink smudged as though tears had fallen upon the page. Each entry revealed the internal struggle that had been invisible to the villagers. He wrote of Anna Weiss, the young woman in the choir, and of Marta, the woman whose fate would intertwine with his own in ways he could not control. He detailed moments of kindness, brief touches of affection, and the unbearable weight of secrecy. She comes to confession each week, her hands trembling, her eyes wide with fear and hope. I cannot absolve what I feel, nor can I betray what I must protect. The line between duty and desire blurs, and I walk it alone. What was striking was his awareness that the village watched silently. He knew that even the children noticed the change in him, that fear and suspicion grew as he grew more isolated. As the diary progressed through the year, the tone darkened. In May, he wrote, "I hear whispers now, not from the village, but from the church itself. I imagine the walls breathing, listening, waiting. I cannot rest. I do not trust myself. I pray, but the answers do not come." By October, the diary suggested a sense of impending doom. The council meets without me. They speak in hushed tones. I feel judgment from every face. Their silence is louder than any accusation. I dread December, though I do not know why. Perhaps it is my punishment, though I have not sinned, or perhaps I have sinned too deeply to recall. The entries on the final week of November and early December were fragmented, almost frantic. Matthias wrote repeatedly of the red-shawled woman, of voices, of bells that rang without cause, of footsteps that echoed behind him even when the church was empty. December 10th, I cannot bear her sorrow. She comes to me, weeping silently. I am weak. The rules I swore to uphold weigh upon me like stones. If I act, I betray God. If I do not, I betray her. What path remains for a man who loves too much and too little? December 12th, the night before he vanished, is the most revealing. I have prayed. I have confessed in secret. The walls call to me now. I hear the stones weeping. Tomorrow, I will seal our fate. She will not suffer alone. If I go, then perhaps the village can forget. Perhaps they can continue to believe, even if truth dies here. The final lines were almost illegible, scrawled in haste, "Forgive me." In silence, we find absolution. In stone, we are hidden. In faith, we are judged. Keller turned the pages again and again. Each line reinforced what the forensic team had discovered: this was not a simple crime. It was a deliberate act of self-sacrifice, twisted devotion, and fatal obedience to a moral code no one else could understand. But the diary did more than recount events. It revealed the psychology of the man, the constant oscillation between human desire and spiritual duty, between secrecy and exposure. It showed a priest who had loved too deeply, who had failed to navigate a world that demanded perfection, and who had ultimately chosen death over scandal. When journalists asked Keller about the diary, she hesitated. "It's like hearing a voice from the past," she said. "It's intimate, painful, terrifying. You feel the man and the priest at once, one body, one soul, torn in two directions. Reading it, you understand why the village never spoke. The burden was too heavy. And when he disappeared, they thought it was mercy. They were wrong. They were all wrong." The diary also contained sketches, crude outlines of the church interior, of walls, of hidden alcoves. Most were barely legible, but one clearly depicted a cavity behind the altar wall, where the bodies would eventually be found. Father Matthias had mapped it himself, perhaps to ensure that if discovery ever came, it would follow a path he had designed. The implication was staggering. He had not been a passive victim. He had orchestrated the concealment of both himself and the woman, a plan of protection disguised as punishment, wrapped in religious devotion, sealed behind stone for decades. Keller paused at one entry that seemed to foreshadow what she had uncovered during the excavation. If the village listens not, then the wall will speak. If the people forget, then the stone remembers. We will remain silent together, but the truth will linger, waiting for those who dare to look. It was almost prophetic. The diary provided crucial context to the sketches Johann Bauer had drawn as a child. The bleeding walls, the trapped figure, the red shawl, everything matched the memories of the boy with the forensic evidence discovered decades later. Matthias's own words confirmed that these were not hallucinations. The child had witnessed fragments of the truth and recorded them as best he could. Every drawing, every faint memory, every whispered story became tangible through the priest's diary. Keller realized the diary did more than explain the past, it also explained the village's decades-long silence. The community had not merely feared scandal. They had lived under the weight of knowledge that their priest had chosen death over exposure, and that their compliance had become part of a moral covenant. In a sense, Altenbruck's faith had been built on complicity. Every service avoided, every wedding cancelled, every hymn unsung was a thread in the fabric of collective atonement. And the diary was proof that Father Matthias had intended it that way. The final paragraph of the diary remains haunting. If someone ever finds this, know that we acted with devotion, if not with wisdom. The walls will speak louder than we ever could. In our silence, let others judge. In our faith, let God forgive. And remember, even stone remembers what man forgets. Keller closed the diary slowly, letting the words sink in. The room was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Outside, the rain continued to fall on Altenbruck, washing the cobblestones and whispering through the trees. She understood now, this was not merely a story of death. It was a story of human frailty, devotion, secrecy, and the terrible cost of silence. Narration Q, voiceover. Father Matthias Kruger's diary did not simply recount events. It revealed a man torn between flesh and faith, a village bound by guilt, and a secret buried so deeply that even time itself could not erase it. And yet, the walls waited. Always, they waited, for the day someone would finally listen. The village of Altenbruck had long been quiet. For decades, the townspeople had moved through life as if their memories were wrapped in thick, invisible cloth. Children grew up hearing only fragments of the past, stories passed in whispers, warnings disguised as folk tales, admonitions couched in hymns. No one spoke openly of Father Matthias, the red-shawled woman, or the terrible events of 1962. And yet, the echoes of that winter lingered in every alley, every shuttered window, every frozen smile. When Dr. Keller returned to the village after the forensic revelations, she was struck by the weight of silence. People watched her from a distance, hesitant to approach. Their eyes told stories they refused to voice, shame, fear, sorrow, perhaps even complicity. She decided to speak to those willing to talk, though they were few. Her first interview was with Frau Stein, an elderly woman in her 80s. She had witnessed the final days of Father Matthias and had remained in Altenbruck her entire life. Her hands trembled as she led Keller into her modest kitchen, the walls lined with faded photographs and yellowed lace curtains. "I was young," Frau Stein said, voice quivering. "But I remember. I remember the way he looked at her, the way the candles flickered. The church, it wasn't the same afterward. Something died in it. Something innocent." She paused, folding her hands tightly. "We all said nothing. We had to. You cannot speak of such things. Not a word. To speak is to dishonor the dead, and perhaps to awaken them." Keller noted the phrasing carefully, awaken them. It suggested that the villagers feared not just scandal, but retribution, or perhaps a lingering supernatural presence. Next, she spoke with her Bauer, Johann's father, whose own memory of the child's drawings had long been buried beneath decades of silence. Hans was different, he said quietly, pouring tea. He saw things, drew things. We told him to stop. He never did. Some things, you do not ask a child to understand. But, we all knew. Oh, we knew. Bauer's voice caught. His hands shook over the cup. The priest. Marta, it was wrong in one way, right in another. You cannot explain such things to ordinary minds. So we closed our mouths. We looked away. And we prayed. It became clear to Keller that the silence of the village was deliberate. Not denial, not forgetfulness, but an active pact, a collective choice to bury the truth alongside Father Matthias and the woman. Over the next few days, Keller spoke to a handful of other villagers. Each account added fragments to the puzzle. A former choir member recalled the priest pacing alone at night, muttering to the walls. A farmer described seeing bricks laid behind the altar, long before anyone reported a disappearance. A baker remembered that Christmas of 1962 felt different, though he could not articulate why. Every story shared was a mix of fear, guilt, and reverence. The villagers were haunted not by law, but by conscience and belief. The more Keller listened, the more she realized that Father Matthias's fate had become a moral template for Altenbruck, a story embedded into their rituals, their silences, their understanding of justice and penance. Johann Bauer, now elderly, provided the most poignant insight. Sitting in his dim living room, he pulled out the faded sketches he had made as a child, the bleeding walls, the trapped figure, the red shawl. I drew what I saw, he said softly. No one wanted to believe me. No one wanted to see it. But the church remembered. The walls never forgot. Hans traced the lines with a trembling finger, his eyes distant. The village remained silent because we were afraid of the truth. Afraid of what it meant. Afraid that telling it would bring harm. The priest, he gave us the choice. Live in silence, or confront something too terrible to bear. It was a chilling insight. Silence was not merely a social norm, it was a survival mechanism, a pact of the living to contain the dead, a covenant with memory itself. Keller visited the old rectory, now empty and crumbling. The air was heavy, the smell of decayed wood and mildew pervasive. She traced her fingers along the walls, imagining Father Matthias pacing, whispering, perhaps even plotting the final concealment. Outside, the village remained still. Even the wind seemed cautious. A local priest, Father Benedict, told her privately, Altenbruck does not forget. We merely choose not to speak. The church carries the memory, not us. The walls remember. And so do the stones of the rectory. It became clear that the physical church had become a vessel for collective memory and guilt. Every brick, every cracked plaster, every hidden cavity was a repository of shame and devotion intertwined. That evening, Keller walked through the snow-covered square. The church tower loomed, casting a shadow over the village like a silent sentinel. The bell, long out of use, emitted a faint metallic echo whenever the wind shifted. She could almost hear the voices of the villagers, carried on the gusts, stories left untold, secrets unspoken. Some were terrified, some remorseful, some indifferent. Yet all were bound by a shared legacy of silence, a unity forged in fear and reverence. Keller understood that the story of Father Matthias and the red-shawled woman could not be told fully without acknowledging the village itself, not just as witnesses, but as participants, guardians, and victims of the secret. Narration Q, voiceover, in Altenbruck, silence was more than a virtue, it was survival. Every family, every street, every whispering child carried the weight of what had been hidden behind the walls. The village itself had become a character, one that watched, waited, and remembered, long after its priest had vanished and the woman had been buried beside him. Beneath the polished floors of St. Gertrude's, beneath the pews where generations had knelt in prayer, lay secrets that no hymn could exorcise. The excavation and the diary had revealed much, but it was only when Dr. Keller began studying old architectural plans and obscure parish records that she began to uncover the true purpose of the church's hidden chambers. The walls themselves had been repurposed not just for concealment of bodies, but for ritualistic acts, acts that blurred the line between devotion, punishment, and something darker. In the parish ledger, dated 1958, she found references to a private consecration, a ceremony reserved for sins deemed too dangerous for public acknowledgement. It mentioned the construction of hidden alcoves, the laying of lime and wooden boards, and a strict commandment of silence, only the faithful shall witness, the walls shall bear memory. Dr. Keller realized that Father Matthias was not simply a victim or a perpetrator. He had been both orchestrator and penitent, following rules known only to him and perhaps a select few within the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Each hidden cavity, each concealed recess in the stone, was a marker of secrecy, a vessel for atonement. She walked slowly through the church, tracing the walls with gloved hands. A hollow sound echoed when she tapped near the altar, confirming her suspicions: the walls were not solid. Behind them, the cavities had been intentionally crafted, designed to trap not just the bodies, but the very memory of sin. One evening, Father Benedict allowed Keller to view old ritual texts stored in the basement. They were small, leather-bound manuscripts, yellowed with age, detailing rites that were seldom performed outside of remote rural parishes. Among the instructions was a passage that chilled her to the bone: when sin is too great for public pardon, seal the transgressor within consecrated walls. Let silence guard the penitent. Let faith endure where flesh has failed. Another passage described the process in meticulous detail: the binding of hands, the placement of sacred objects, the sealing with lime and mortar, and a final blessing that invoked divine absolution for both the living and the dead. The parallels with Father Matthias's actions were unmistakable. The bodies found behind the altar, the priest and the woman, had been subjected to these rituals. Every fracture, every trace of lime, every carefully arranged relic aligned with the instructions in the manuscripts. Yet there were anomalies. The sketches from Johann Bauer, the child witness, depicted bleeding walls. The diary suggested voices, echoes, and shadows. Could the rituals have unintended consequences? Perhaps the walls absorbed more than just secrecy. Perhaps they absorbed fear, pain, guilt, the very essence of human suffering. The deeper Keller dug into parish records, the more she uncovered hints of other instances. Mentions of lost parishioners, entries smudged or erased, sudden departures, and unexplained closures of ritual chambers. She began to suspect that Altenbruck's dark history did not begin with Father Matthias, nor end with him. The church itself, as a structure and symbol, had long been a vessel for hidden transgressions. One evening, while cataloging notes, Keller found a reference to a local legend: the walls remember the sins of men. They whisper at night, warning those who seek to unseal them. She dismissed it at first as folklore, until she visited the sealed wall again. Tapping lightly with her gloved knuckles, she thought she heard faint responses, a hollow echo that sounded almost like a voice, carried through centuries of stone. Interviews with the villagers provided further context. One elderly man recounted how children were warned not to touch certain areas of the church. Another mentioned that on stormy nights, faint chanting could sometimes be heard, though no one could explain its origin. "It's not the priest," one man said. "It's the walls themselves. They hold what we cannot." The idea that architecture itself could serve as a repository of memory and guilt fascinated Keller. The walls were more than concealment, they were participants in the ritual, silently observing, punishing, and preserving the weight of human actions. Keller also discovered that the bricks used to seal the hidden chambers bore faint inscriptions, crosses, initials, symbols of absolution, and cryptic phrases in Latin. She meticulously photographed each mark, noting its placement, orientation, and potential meaning. Among the inscriptions was a repeated phrase: "Silentium custodiet veritatem." Silence guards the truth. The message was clear. The walls were intended to outlast human memory, to enforce obedience through fear, and to carry both penance and secrecy through time. The combination of child sketches, forensic evidence, diary entries, and ritual texts began to reveal a pattern of intergenerational concealment. The church was not merely a place of worship, it was a stage for human frailty, a vessel for divine punishment, and a silent witness to the consequences of love, lust, fear, and devotion. Keller noted one particularly striking line in the diary: "If someone ever finds this, let them understand that walls do not forget what hearts cannot forgive." It became increasingly clear that the village's silence, the priest's death, the woman's death, and the hidden rituals were all intertwined, forming a network of secrecy that spanned decades. By the final day of her investigation into the rituals, Keller had pieced together a chilling sequence. Father Matthias becomes aware of the woman's forbidden presence. He follows the instructions in secret ritual texts. The bodies are concealed behind the altar wall, sealed with lime and mortar. The village is sworn to silence, a tacit agreement reinforced by fear and reverence. The church itself becomes a living repository, preserving not just the bodies, but the moral weight of the act. It was a horrifying yet elegant system, one that had ensured the secret remained intact for 60 years. The moment of revelation came like a slow, deliberate exhale, subtle at first, then overwhelming. After weeks of excavations, diary analysis, forensic reports, and interviews, Dr. Keller felt that she was close to understanding the full scope of Altenbruck's secret. But nothing could have prepared her for what the final inspection of the church revealed. She returned one evening, alone, with only her flashlight and a small camera. The church was silent, except for the faint hum of wind rattling against the stained glass. Each step across the creaking floorboards echoed like a drumbeat, a reminder that she was walking through a monument built upon decades of secrecy, fear, and devotion. Keller moved toward the altar, where the bricks had been partially removed during the initial excavation. The cavity had been studied extensively, yet something had always seemed unresolved, a feeling that the walls held more than bones. She knelt, examining the mortar closely, and noticed faint discolorations that suggested the presence of hidden objects or inscriptions beneath the surface. Using a small laser scanner, she mapped the inner walls of the cavity in detail. What appeared to be solid stone revealed a series of tiny, carefully concealed alcoves, nearly invisible to the naked eye. Each alcove contained remnants of the priest's and woman's belongings, a rosary bead, a fragment of cloth, a rusted key, and other personal items. But in the center of the cavity, there was one alcove that had gone unnoticed, slightly larger, deeper, and marked by faint etchings on its interior wall. Inside it was a small, folded parchment, carefully preserved despite decades of decay. Keller opened it slowly, her gloved hands trembling. The parchment contained a confession, a narrative written in Father Matthias's own hand, a document intended to explain the unexplainable. To whoever finds this, know that our actions were not crimes of passion, nor acts of malice. We were guided by rules that demanded devotion, secrecy, and sacrifice. I bound her to me not to harm, but to protect. We were both condemned by circumstance, yet absolved by our own faith. The confession continued, revealing a truth more complex than Keller had imagined. Father Matthias had discovered that a faction within the village council had been aware of Marta's presence and her growing influence within the church. They had seen her as a threat to the priest's authority and the parish's perceived sanctity. They would have taken her from me, or worse, allowed her to be punished by the community. I could not let that happen. Our deaths were the only protection I could guarantee. If the walls took us, then the village could remain untainted, and she would not suffer at their hands. Keller felt a chill run down her spine. The duality was clear. Father Matthias was both a participant and a protector, complicit in secrecy yet committed to shielding the innocent from the very community that demanded silence. The confession also contained a final, startling revelation. The priest described how he had arranged a small mechanism within the wall, a pressure-activated cavity designed to release a message to anyone who later opened the bricks. If the walls are ever breached, the truth must speak. Let the finder know that silence was never cowardice, it was survival. Let them understand that faith can bind as tightly as chains, and love can demand as much as death itself. This explained the strange markings, the etchings, and even the faint whispers that locals had reported for decades. The church itself had been transformed into a living testament of secrecy and devotion, an architectural confessional that held both bodies and conscience in equal measure. Keller stepped back and ran her fingers along the cavity walls. The weight of generations pressed against her. Every inch of stone, every hidden alcove, and every fragment left behind by Father Matthias and Marta was designed to endure, a silent message spanning time. It was in that moment that she realized the true scope of the story. This was not merely a case of crime, passion, or tragedy. This was a narrative of human psychology, morality, and societal complicity. The village had remained silent, not out of fear alone, but out of an understanding instilled by the priest: some truths are too heavy to bear, and some sins are too dangerous to expose. To confirm the confession's authenticity, Keller cross-referenced the handwriting with letters, parish records, and the diary. Every stroke matched. Every linguistic pattern, every idiosyncratic phrase was consistent with Father Matthias's writing style. The final lines of the confession were a mixture of penance, hope, and despair: may this truth reach those who dare to seek it. May it offer solace to the innocent and understanding to the guilty. And may God forgive us for placing silence above words, stone above speech, and death above life. Keller closed the parchment, letting the words settle. She felt an overwhelming sense of closure, yet also of awe. The narrative that had haunted Altenbruck for 60 years had finally spoken, but in a language that demanded reflection rather than judgment. The next day, Keller shared her findings with the village council, local historians, and the remaining family members of those involved. The reaction was a mixture of shock, grief, and reluctant acceptance. Some wept openly, finally acknowledging the truth that had been shrouded for decades. Others quietly returned to their routines, internalizing the confession in silence. For many, the revelation was not a scandal, but a release, a validation that their decades-long silence had not been meaningless, but a protective measure orchestrated by Father Matthias himself. The forensic team also confirmed a startling discovery: the walls were indeed constructed to preserve both physical remains and the psychological essence of the secret. The bricks had been carefully chosen for durability, the lime had acted as a preservative, and the hidden alcoves were aligned in a way that distributed weight to prevent collapse. Even the fragments of cloth, the rosary beads, and the parchment were meticulously preserved, a testament to the precision and foresight of the priest. The combination of architectural genius, ritualistic knowledge, and human psychology made Altenbruck's church unique, a vessel of memory that transcended ordinary understanding. By the end of her investigation, Keller had documented every inch of the church, catalogued every artifact, and recorded every testimony. Yet she knew the story would linger long after her departure. The walls, the village, and the memory of Father Matthias and Marta would continue to speak, in whispers and echoes, to anyone who chose to listen. As she stood in the church one last time, the fading sunlight casting elongated shadows across the altar, she understood the full weight of what had transpired. The priest and the woman had died together, yet their story endured. The village had remained silent, yet their complicity had preserved a moral covenant. And the church, with its hidden walls and secret alcoves, had become a guardian of truth, memory, and consequence.